So I'm just going to dive right in since it's noon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Bostic, and I am the Sustainable Agriculture Extension Agent in both Sarasota and DeSoto counties down here on the west coast of Florida. Thank you so much for joining us for today's edible gardening series class. We're going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes talking about watering your garden, which down here in Florida is a very, very big topic. I know it varies a good bit in importance depending on where you are in the country, but down here in our sandy soils, it's incredibly important. So I am joined today by two of my wonderful coworkers, including Carol Wyatt Evans, who is the Chemicals and the Environment Agent, also in the Sarasota County office. And you can see her contact info right there on your screen. I'm also joined by Mindy Hannock, who is the Community and School Garden Coordinator in Sarasota County Extension Office as well. So we're going to dive right in. If you have questions, type them right there into that chat box you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a little text message symbol. Click on that and you'll be able to send us questions directly. So when I'm done talking, Carol and Mindy will start the process of reading questions and the three of us will answer them. And your questions can be about watering or anything related whatsoever to edible gardening. Okay, so here we go. Session 8, watering techniques. And the reason that we started this webinar series, and this is week 8, is because we get so many people who walk into our office or call our office who are really struggling with some of the fundamentals of gardening in Florida or in other places that they're fairly unfamiliar with. Folks that used to have a green thumb and then they moved to Florida and discovered very quickly that everything they knew about gardening really was turned on its head and are struggling to figure it out. So that's the perspective I'm taking on today's topic, but everything we talk about today is just as relevant regardless of where you are. Okay, so watering. Watering is a really interesting process for sure, and it's one that is more of an art than a science. But to throw a little science in there, I'm going to start with this chart. This is a chart of average rainfall in Sarasota County, Florida, which is where our office is. And so you can see on this chart, and you don't have to really understand it, but that we don't get an even amount of rainfall across the course of the year. And this is a fairly typical pattern across a lot of the United States, where you get your rainfall in one really specific time of the year, and then it's dry in another part of the year. Very, very few parts of the country actually get consistent rainfall throughout the year. So one thing that means is that the amount that you're going to have to keep up with watering is simply going to change throughout the course of the year. So one rule of thumb is that most full-size plants need 1 to 2 inches of water per week. And you can see here on this chart where we are, the months of the year when our growing season is down here, which is not typical for the rest of the country, but our peak growing season is September through April. It's actually the fall, winter, and spring months. That happens to be the dry season where we are. And over the course of an entire month, we're getting only about the amount of rain that full-size plants need each week. So one thing that means in our area is definitely that you have to water. Regardless of how good you are with your gardening techniques, it's really hard to grow vegetables down here in our dry season without watering. So take a look at some of your average rainfall data for your area and see how much rain is actually falling from the sky during those times when you're growing. It may be that your plants are actually going to get most of what they need from the sky, and it may be that they need to get most of it from you. So how much do you water? How do you water? When do you water? All those things. And of course, everyone's least favorite answer is it depends. But in the case of watering your vegetable garden, it really does depend. It depends on a lot of different things. It depends on your soil type. If you're in sandy soil, that soil is going to dry out much more quickly than clay soil or silty soil. It depends on how much organic matter is in your soil. Organic matter is often that part of soil that makes soil like dark and rich and kind of earthy smelling. Soils that are really low in organic matter don't really hold on to water very well. It's going to depend on whether or not there's any degree of slope in your growing space. If you're growing in a hilly area versus a very flat area, the amount of water you're going to have to provide your plants is going to be different because some of that water would run off in a sloped area. Time of year, that's really obvious, but it's, you know, it's a whole combination of things like, is it hot? Is it cold? Is it sunny? Is it cloudy? Are you in this part of your season where you have really long days where the sun's up for many, many hours, or are you growing the shortest time daylight of the year? All of those things impact how much water. Size of plant, maturity of the root system, types of plants, they all depends very heavily, or all determines very heavily how much water you give. Mulched soil requires much less water than bare soil. So just the sheer act of mulching actually will save you a lot of watering. And then other little simple things too, like if you're actually gardening in containers rather than directly in the ground, the size of your container compared to the size of the plant in that container, as well as the material of the container, is really going to determine how much water and how often. So, you know, for just a visual example of how much should I water and how greatly that differs, like if you just look at those two little drawings, you know, you can just inherently know that one of these scenarios is going to require less water than the other. So if you have large full-size plants and you're growing in bare soil on a really sunny day when it's really hot outside, that plant's going to require a huge amount more water than a small plant growing in mulched soil on in a shady area on a cool day. Very different. And that's one of the things that makes figuring out watering so tricky. And a lot of folks want kind of just like that magic amount to provide each week, set it on a timer and go. And that's what makes it so tricky, is that there isn't just that magic amount that works for all plants. So I want to just show you some more visuals of how different, just of how differently plants will take water up. And so a really good rule of thumb just to keep in your mind is that the amount of root that is below ground, or excuse me, the amount of plant that's above ground is really similar to the amount of root actually supporting that plant below ground. And so, you know, think about how much a plant that only has a tiny little root system can even pull up into it. It just doesn't have much capacity to pull a lot of water compared to a plant that has a much larger root system. And then just as just a visual of what, you know, something like growing in unglazed terracotta looks like. Unglazed terracotta, I personally think is beautiful. I think it's an absolutely beautiful type of container to grow plants in. However, it dries out very, very fast, and you often get very water stressed plants. So in these pictures, every single plant that you see, except maybe that sage right there, is very water stressed. These are basil plants back here. This clearly looks like basil that is not going to taste good. You can see how the leaves have gotten pale and very angular, kind of tough looking. This is cilantro down here that is so stressed out that it created flowers and seeds before it ever really fleshed out into a plant. So that's how impactful the type of container can be on how much watering you need to do. And this little plant over here is a very sad looking pepper plant that is just totally water starved. So plants need really differing amounts of water depending on a lot of different scenarios, right? And so there are also, of course, so many different ways to water. And really the three categories that you can break that down into are watering by hand, either with something like a garden hose or a watering can. And I love this picture that you can see on your screen. This is a picture in Southeast Asia. I actually can't remember which country this is from, but this is you know, like a completely different take on a watering can. I've never thought about watering like this, but this is what small scale farming watering can look like when you don't have things like irrigation systems. You as a person become that irrigation system. And I also put this picture in here just to highlight, you can see here on your screen, to highlight how high that flow is coming out of those watering cans. So one thing to keep in mind is that every watering can you will ever pick up is going to have a slightly different flow, like a slightly different amount of water that comes out. So I can't even really give you like a, you know, when you're watering full-size tomato plants, stand and water that tomato for 10 seconds with your watering can, because I have no idea what the flow of your watering can is. So much of the process of learning how to water effectively comes from observation. So other ways to water are with manual irrigation systems, automatic irrigation systems, and and various combinations therein. But whatever way you choose to water, remember that what you're really wanting to water is the root system of the plants and not the leaves. That's really key to preventing disease and also getting water where it's needed, which is down in the root system where the plants can actually pull it up into the body of the plants. Okay, so in terms of irrigation systems, even really small gardens can really benefit from some sorts of irrigation systems. And I'm going to do just a really brief dive into some of these terms because it can be really, really confusing when you start shopping for irrigation systems, at a hardware store or a big box store or a garden center. And so knowing what some of these terms mean can be really helpful. So one term you'll run into is drip emitter, as in something that emits or lets off water. So drip emitters are good for plants that have wide or irregular spacing, like potted plants, raised beds, even things like a small orchard. And you usually attach them directly to a larger tube somewhere, a larger irrigation tube somewhere in your garden. Or to something called spaghetti tubing. And spaghetti tubing is a flexible hose that you can run directly into a potted plant, for example. Another term you will run into is called a bubbler. A bubbler has a really high flow rate, as in a lot of water comes out at one time. Bubblers can be good for trees and shrubs, but they release way too much water for your typical vegetable crops. You'll end up really overwatering and causing some issues with bubblers. Microjet sprayers are a little contraption that literally sprays small amounts of water. And it can cover, but that small amount of water can really cover a large area, up to about 8 feet. So some folks really like this for gardens. You have to be a little careful with it because microjet sprayers are spraying water more on the leaf system than down at the root area of plants. So if you struggle with any sort of bacterial or fungal or viral diseases in your garden, you might want to steer clear of microjet sprayers. And then drip tubing. So this is another term that you will see a good bit of. And drip tubing is literally really small diameter, usually no more than about 1/2 inch diameter tube that can run through your garden. They are generally made for landscape plants. They have a moderate amount, kind of a moderate flow rate of water that comes out of them. It's generally pretty high flow rate compared to what vegetable plants want. It's definitely made more for perennial landscape plants, but you can also just run it for a short amount of time, so a less amount of time than you'd run for your landscape plants. One thing that's a benefit with drip tubing is that it comes perforated with these small holes at very regular spacing throughout the tube. So that tube literally just drips water, usually at 12-inch intervals, right there at the base of your plants, right where you want it. Rather than just dousing your whole garden, it gets water just where your plant roots need it. So you'll really save a lot of water by using something like drip tubing. And then drip tape, as opposed to drip tubing. Drip tape is a really similar concept, except instead of a hard, somewhat flexible tube, drip tape is literally comes kind of wound up in a tube, just like tape would be, or not in a tube, but in a roll rather. And so it's like a flat and very flexible kind of hose of sorts, with the same sort of idea though, where it comes pre-perforated with small holes at regular spacing. And this is really widely used by vegetable farms, but it can be hard to find in small quantities, like in quantities less than about a 600-foot roll. So those are some terms that you'll run into. So the next thing to think about is whether or not you want to make your system automatic. And so there's benefits and drawbacks to making your system automatic. And the way you do that is by connecting your irrigation system to an irrigation timer. And there's lots and lots of irrigation timers on the market that are geared towards home gardeners, that are, quite inexpensive, somewhere in the realm of $30 for a totally decent, very simple timer. But there's benefits and drawbacks to timers. One benefit to putting your irrigation system on a timer is that you can leave. You can go away for a few days. They are also pretty inexpensive. You can, depending on which timer you purchase, you can also program your timer into different zones in your garden. So you can have one zone, maybe your full-size tomato plants that run for 30 minutes twice a week, and then your herb zone that maybe only runs for 15 minutes once a week, something like that. So you can actually start the process of changing how you water different sets of things. And then some of the fancier timers will actually link to cell phone apps. So you can adjust your water schedule based on things like your local rainfall or really like cloudy days and things like that. So even if you're on vacation, you can pay attention to what's happening in the weather back home. Some of the drawbacks is the only way that you know they're working is to actually go check them. So a lot of folks run into trouble with irrigation timers because they kind of set them and just forget them. But irrigation timers sometimes malfunction. And it's also just really important to spend time in your garden and notice how much water is impacting plants. Are they getting enough or not enough? You're less likely to notice leaks in your garden irrigation system if you have a timer set as well. If they're battery operated, those batteries do run out, so you do have to check them. They can be damaged by both freezing temperatures and really intense heat in direct sun. And then a lot of folks in Florida really like to hire an irrigation crew to set up their irrigation system. And I just want to highlight that there is a learning curve with vegetable garden irrigation systems. And many irrigation installation crews are really, really good at landscape irrigation, but they don't necessarily have the background on vegetable garden irrigation systems. So you really want to pay attention to how that irrigation system gets set up if you're hiring a company, and try to find someone that actually knows vegetable garden irrigation. So one more or a couple more little quick tips is that if you're growing, especially in something like a raised bed and it's been very, very dry, before you start planting, about 2 days before you start planting, start the process of rehydrating that soil. Soil can get really, really, really dry, especially if it's like a soilless potting medium like you can see in these raised beds. It can dry out to the extent that they really have trouble rehydrating. So you may end up having to spend quite a bit of time and water getting that soil to actually absorb water again. So I'm going to leave you with just a few little rules of thumb, which are: the smaller the plant. It seems like a really obvious statement, but it is not always when you're actually in a garden. So the smaller the plant, the less water it needs. However, that doesn't mean that the frequency of watering is going to also be less with small plants. The frequency of watering doesn't tend to change much with the size of the plant. And then water the roots, not the leaves of the plant. And the absolute best way to conserve water and use as little as possible is to mulch your garden. Keep that soil covered. So that's what I've got for you today. Thanks so much.